Hello, my name is Ethan with Cannabis Place, and today I'll be talking to you about trichomes, cannabinoids, and terpenes, where they're found on the plant, as well as having a close-up look actually, at the anatomy of the trichome on plants at different stages of its flowering life. So first of all, we'll be looking at it during its veg stage, basically prior to it going through its flower cycle, early flower cycle, and post-cure. Before we get underway and take a close-up look of the anatomy of a real plant, I just wanted to take a quick look at an artistic representation of what a trichome actually looks like. As you can see in this image, it's almost like a mushroom. This is a plant that's well into flower because the actual secretory cells and vesicles have created such a large quantity of trichomes and terpenes that it's almost given it that swollen top look that's like a mushroom tip. You wouldn't see this on a plant that's in veg at all. Early flowering, there might be some that have developed to this level. The actual vast majority of these trichomes are found on the flower. The sugar leaves protrude from this flower, and if you've never seen the flower of a cannabis plant, it is quite different than most flowers, as it uses the fan leaves as the petals of the flower, which is interesting. And they themselves get covered in trichomes, as the vast majority of the density is found around the flower itself. You do get some on the leaves, like the actual fan leaves, as well as the casing on the seeds, the protective shell, and also on the branches themselves, but it's just not even close to the same amount of density. As can be seen in the slide, I think 4% THC is contained in the leaves, while 25 to 30% is in the flowers. So as you can see, the plant puts most of its energy into the flower itself, which, if you think about it, makes sense. This is the plant's last-ditch effort to procreate, create its seeds to transmit its genetic material to the next generation. It's how plants and animals basically skip death. They pass their information on to avoid overcoming immortality. So yeah. So this is the cannabis plant's way of doing it. It uses the pungent smell and bitter taste to either attract pollinators, and in the case of the smell, as well as the pungent taste, it's like a bitter, very bitter taste in the raw plant, is to deter most predators, like herbivores and stuff like that, but really it doesn't work. In Canada, you have deer and stuff like that, just eat them. Australia, I'm assuming kangaroos and the vast majority of other herbivores will eat them. They don't really care. It's more for where the plant is native that it actually has an effect. The cannabinoids themselves are made in the trichomes. They do get made in the other parts of the plant as well, but the vast majority are made in the trichome. So you will find them within the actual stem and whatnot. Like the cannabinoids themselves do get transported through the vascular system of the plant. But the vast majority of the trichomes do get generated and stored in the secretory vesicles in the ends of trichomes. The trichome itself is separated into two parts. So it's a good way of thinking about it is the gland head and the stalk itself, so the trichome stalk. So the head contains all the cannabinoids, terpenes, and then the stalk itself is obviously just a stable base to attach to the plant, as well as aiding in supplying nutrition to these secretory cells, basal cells, stripe cells, all those fun cells that seem to be incorporated in creating these cannabinoids and terpenes for the plant. It's not the best magnification, but on a plant that is, I don't believe it's even in flower yet, it's very early veg. As you can see, the plant is quite lush and green. This is just the fan leaves of the plant. There is no flower that has been developed yet. It looks like it's out of focus at the moment, unfortunately. But the trichomes, as you can see on these ones, very small, wispy hairs. There's no like circular bulbous tip that you can see on the end of them. It's very infant at the moment. It hasn't actually put much energy into growing the trichomes. It's been putting all its energy into growing the fan leaves to basically give the plant the best base to set itself up for procreation, essentially. So this plant is, from memory, early into the flower cycle. So this is probably about 3 weeks into the flower cycle. As you can see, it's a bit closer magnification, so it's not the best representation, but you can start seeing that the bulbous heads appearing on some of the trichomes as the plant's putting more of its energy into creating these terpenes and cannabinoids. So this is basically the first stages, usually during the flowering stage. As you switch from the veg stage, you do get kind of an in-between where the plant's almost like a hybrid. It's putting energy into both, so you get a bit of a growth phase, like an accelerate growth due to the light changes, because basically the plant goes into flower when the light cycle hits something close that represents 12 hours of light, 12 hours of darkness, while during summer in Australia definitely you get 18 hours of light, and this prevents the plant going into flower. This image here, or this video, is of a cured plant, and as you can see, the trichomes are very, very different, mainly because the water and the nutrients in the plant being cured, it's dried out. When I say the nutrients, I mean the nutrients of the actual plant, not necessarily the trichomes. The trichomes are untouched in the cure itself because they're on the outside of the plant, but they're very different in appearance. They don't have that glassy, clear look anymore. They've got almost like a milky solution in the trichome, and this solution is basically what we want for medication purposes, for treating certain illnesses like epilepsy and whatnot. The entourage effect that's inside these trichomes is it interacts with the endocannabinoid system in the brain essentially, and they cause an effect that is almost like a supplement depending on the disease and the genetic strain that you're looking at. But say someone who's got an epilepsy, for example, it could restore balance within, it could reduce the firing rate of the neurons in their brain, so they're less active and less likely to fire and cause like a cascading epileptic fit. So the plant has many benefits, largely depends on the genetic strains. But yeah, the trichomes contain all the medical benefits in the largest dosages. Of course, the rest of the plant's also beneficial and gets used. Nothing gets wasted when it comes to the cultivation of the medical marijuana. The curing takes a while, usually takes about 3 weeks. So you start off early, basically putting the plant into a mason jar and then slowly burping it to reduce the moisture, and it basically makes the plant a lot smoother to smoke. But for medical purposes, smoking it's a bad idea. It's just there's too many other complications involved, such as irritating the lungs and whatnot. So from a medical point of view, one of the best ways is either a mucosal spray or a dripper through the mouth, or anything that essentially bypasses irritating the lungs and goes into the bloodstream quicker. So it's just a little bit of a recap, because I've spoken about most of this already, but where are the cannabinoids, terpenes and trichomes found? So yeah, it is mostly in the outer layer of the trichome. That's because the secretory cells like to create these vesicles, and it almost pushes them towards the surface as one gets moved. It's almost like one of those coin machines that you get at the arcade where you put a new coin in, it pushes all the other coins slightly, and you have a chance of pushing the ones that are really close off the edge. Similar kind of secretory system going on here, where basically the plant's just trying to create lots of these little fat-like bubbles essentially that are full of these cannabinoids and terpenes and whatnot, and essentially it's doing this as a way to procreate, as I've said. The actual mixture that's inside these trichomes, it's most people think of it as CBD and THC, but there's a lot more cannabinoids and terpenes than that within here. We only know, I think it's 100 of them, but there's thousands of these. And it's just because there's so many little micromolecules and stuff like that alongside the cannabinoids and the terpenes, and they all have an effect. That's why synthetic cannabis strains, and as well as most synthetic medicines, they tend to have a lot of side effects, because you need these terpenes, and as well as the other non-terpenes that are in there within the molecules and whatnot, to aid. It's almost like driving a car. The terpenes are the steering wheel and the cannabinoids are the accelerator, and without the terpenes, you don't get as much bang for your buck because you're not steering in the right direction. This is the best way to think of it. So you can have synthetic THC, for example, and yes, it does have an effect, but it is greatly reduced compared to this entourage effect you get from the terpenes in conjunction. You also get a lot of side effects from synthetics. A lot of people complain of headaches and other kind of nausea, like even though it's meant to suppress nausea, but when you're coming off it, it gives you a lot of side effects, which doesn't get seen nearly even remotely as much in the entourage forms of the medication. So basically the concoction of terpenes and cannabinoids from the strain. So before we wrap up, I just wanted to talk about how it works in the body and why it works in the body, essentially. Largely because the chemical structure of THC, CBD, and the other cannabinoids are very similar to what naturally occurs in the body in a system called the endocannabinoid system. And you have these things called endocannabinoids. And one in particular is anandamide, which is the chemical that gets released in the brain after you go for a run, essentially. That's iconic for the runner's high. Most people say that it is endorphins, but that's not true. It is anandamide, and that's what gives that effect, that positive euphoric effect, cloudy, that you get after you go for a run. You've got that kind of buzz that happens afterwards. So the THC basically hijacks this system. It disrupts it, it mimics it. It causes the cells within the brain, the neurons, to release their dopamine in the CB1 receptor. As you can see in this image, the THC in this image is binding to the CB1 receptor, which is on the presynaptic cell, which is unusual, to be honest. Usually, most systems, well, I'll say usually, commonly systems are not presynaptic, they're postsynaptic, so usually have a action potential which causes the neuron to fire, and the neurotransmitters interact with the postsynaptic cell, which causes another fire, and you get that cascade effect. But this actually attacks, its operation of attack is on the presynaptic cell, so it causes a modulation to this cell. So in this scenario, the CB1 receptor gets interacted with, the presynaptic cell could be releasing dopamine, and then that causes an effect in the postsynaptic cell. And that's what kind of leads to most of the effects from cannabis. You have lots and lots of different systems. This is just a very, very brief explanation. One example would be the hypothalamus in the brain. It uses acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter to basically form short-term memories into long-term memories. And the THC actually interrupts this system as well, essentially in a similar way through these CB1 receptors. And because of that, you get the effects that you see in people with THC where they forget things. You'll be in the middle of a sentence with them and they will just lose their train of thought. It's because their short-term memory is basically affected. But this is not always the case, because you do have strains that have majority CBD, and CBD doesn't have this effect at all. It has quite the opposite effect. It is a very alerting chemical. It's doesn't have that psychotic, not psychotic. But ethanol itself and isopropanol and all that are quite good catalysts or solvents to remove the trichomes from the plant, because it dissolves it essentially into the solution, and then the ethanol or isopropanol, butane, whatever you decide to use, evaporates, and then you're just left with the pure cannabinoid terpene oil, essentially. And you just add a carrier oil alongside it, and this will be used as a medication for people with various diseases depending on the strain. So there are many, many extraction methods, but ethanol extraction, isopropanol, butane, CO2, all that it's very popular, usually because it's a lot cheaper. There are some, like CO2 is expensive, and isopropanol and butane are quite affordable, so quite a easy solution, and there's a lot of recipes and stuff like that have been developed about them for people to follow, so it's quite easy to make your own at home. Not in Australia, obviously, because it's illegal, but within other countries, within the United States, quite a few videos and stuff on YouTube of people who have created certain ways of developing their own extracts and whatnot from the plant. Yeah, you just basically have to go out there and look. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say that, once again, every part of the plant has trichomes on it. The vast majority are on the flower itself, the sugar leaves. But the trichomes themselves contain the majority of the CBD, THC, terpenes and all that. But the plant itself, within the leaves, the stems, and I'd even argue to say the roots themselves, have trace amounts of cannabinoids in them. I say the leaves themselves, and I know for a fact they have small quantities, about 4%, as well as the seeds. Yeah. The entourage effect itself is super important, as THC and CBD on their own aren't as medically beneficial. This is true for most cannabinoids that we know of at the moment. I can't say that for all of them because they're still at such an early field of research, and due to the legal issues, it's just been pushed to the side for so many years, and now 2020 we're finally coming around to it, essentially, to look at the potential medical benefits of this plant. But the entourage effects are definitely important, and not to mention they're not bounded in the same way that synthetics are, where you've only got THC in there and that's the effect. You get one effect for the one chemical you have in there. These have multiple health benefits, depending on the strain and the cannabinoid and terpene combinations within that strain. So different strains are used to basically target different diseases. So the actual plant itself has a large use in the medical industry compared to synthetics, which they do have their use, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't have the same potential, essentially. And from an economic point of view, it's probably cheaper to just cultivate your own plants within your own country and use it to heal your own citizens. And hopefully that will be coming to Australia one day. It already is from a medical point of view, just not on all diseases. It's only really serious stuff like spinal issues, neuropathic pain, stuff like that. Serious stuff, cancer, epilepsy, not necessarily, your common cold, which it's kind of silly, but in America you can get it for some ridiculous things. So hopefully we don't go to that extreme, but we do go a bit more lenient than we are at the moment. The endocannabinoid system as well is responsible for the effect that these cannabinoids and terpenes have on the human body, and essentially it's not the plant or the humans that were designed for this to occur. It's just random chance based on nature. Essentially these chemical structures occur in nature in certain ways that is optimal. So it's more energetically favorable for these chemicals to occur than other ones, so they're more likely to occur, and it just happened that these two lined up, and then you get this effect. So it's not necessarily the watch out, like THC was made for humans. It's just a coincidence, essentially.